for the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities rulemaking process. We know it is mid-December and many of you are probably winding down your work week, so that many of you were able to join today. In a minute, and again, I'm Sylvia Tuborowski, helping to facilitate these meetings, and I'll go over the agenda and some protocols in just a minute, but I'll hand it over first to Commissioner Lilac to provide some welcoming remarks.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see everyone again for our 10th RAC meeting. We're in the final stretch. I saw it, Kirsten. Yeah, our 10th meeting together. It's a lot of hours. We're in the final stretch of this rulemaking effort, with one more meeting scheduled for next month on January 20th. So we're getting close to the finish line. We are so thankful for your engagement with us throughout the process. We recognize it has been a very significant commitment for many, and even larger maybe than some initially anticipated, as we've extended and expanded the process. And I think necessarily so, to make sure we have all the voices from across the state and cities, counties, organizations, CBOs, everybody that's been involved to this point. It's really been a terrific process, and we're not done yet, but we're getting close. And we hope that you're continuing to share our objectives and goals to address climate and equity changes in our state that we really need with the administrative rules that we're all working on together. It continues to be a rich and rewarding conversation. We really appreciate the input that you've all provided in these meetings, in writing, and I know that takes a lot of time outside of these meetings. So as you think through what we discussed, you think through the details, you spend a lot of time and effort sharing your comments with us, and please continue to do so. They really have and continue to make a difference, and including we received a letter in our packet, just as everybody hopefully have seen just within the last couple of days, from other organizations. And one of the things I just want to point out, for example, the city of Bend, they really took the time to go through the rules in great detail and provide very specific comments. And I'm not in a position to say I agree or disagree or otherwise with those, but those types of really specific comments are extremely helpful at this point in the rulemaking process. So continue to take the time and the effort as you are able to share the specifics with us. As we prepare the draft rules for consideration by the full commission, our full Land Conservation and Development Commission, it's going to be critical that we make sure that the rules are implementable, and that we are achieving both the climate friendly and the climate friendly goals, as well as the equitable outcomes. So please, of course, continue to keep that in mind as we go forward. It's also going to be important for the commission, for those of us that serve on the commission, to really understand where the points of disagreement may be among our RAC, among our communities, our stakeholders, everybody that's involved in this process. It will really help us make those final decisions as we go through the public hearing process beginning in the spring, and then concluding by summer, which is what our commitment is to do. Before I turn it back over to Sylvia, I want to highlight there was a major decision yesterday. For those of you that are not aware of it, it was certainly reported in our Bend bulletin this morning that the EQC, the Environmental Quality Commission, and that's the LCDC, the Land Conservation and Development Commission's counterpart with the Department of Environmental Quality. So it's the EQC. They adopted their climate protection program rules yesterday, which is also a very, very significant step toward addressing climate change in our state. So with that, thanks again for being here today. We look forward to your input today and throughout the rest of the process. Sylvia, I will turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for welcoming us so well. I'll go over our agenda for today and then we can dive in. And so for today, we have a number of topics on the agenda. It looks really full, but I think some of this is pretty related. We're going to start with an understanding of how the draft rules respond to the equitable outcome statement. So you'll remember at our early meetings, the RAC really helped develop that equitable outcome statement, and Evan and Kevin will help show how the rules respond to that piece that you all created together. And then we'll get into providing some information on rules for metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction targets. And then want to present a little bit on what we've heard. So the DLCD has heard a lot from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, but also from many other groups and communities and jurisdictions through other meetings. So just wants to provide an overview of kind of what all has been heard. Then we'll have a little break and then we move into report outs. So over the past weeks, months, there have been many work groups that have been formed to really dive into some more detail on the rules. And so you'll hear report outs on the transportation performance standards, transportation system planning work, climate friendly areas, and the transportation modal planning. So kind of report outs from each with a little bit of time for Q&A. And then we're going to dive, and I'm sorry, and also the parking work group. And then we're going to move into discussion groups to really reflect on all that has come out of these work groups and ask you, how are these rules landing for you? What's making sense? What isn't? And really just have a good discussion there. And then we'll just end with some next steps and wrap up. So before we kind of dive into our first topic today, just a few reminders. Hopefully you all received your meeting packets. They were pretty lengthy. They also include a discussion questions worksheet in there. So please remember to refer to that and you'll get information later today on how to respond to some of those questions in the discussion worksheet. Throughout the meeting, we ask that you use the chat just for troubleshooting, meeting management. You can send a message to Ingrid if you need any help. If there's any substantive comments, we hope those are brought into your verbal comments today and discussion. And of course, you can provide more substantive comments through email or the survey. As you know, the meeting is being recorded and a link will be posted to the website later after it's ready. And members of the public that are listening in, you are always welcome to submit comments to the DLCD Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities email address. When we get into our discussion periods, we'll just ask you to raise your hand with the raise hand button. And we all know where this is hopefully by now, but sometimes Zoom changes or you get an update. So if you hover over your screen and see the reactions button at the bottom, there's a raise hand icon right there. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Bill to provide a few DLCD updates before we get into the equitable outcomes topic.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Sylvia. My name is Bill Holmstrom. I'm on DLCD staff here, and I'm just going to give a few quick updates on our schedule. As we know, this is our 10th meeting today. We have scheduled our 11th meeting for next month in January of 2022. And that will be, right now that we're planning for that to be our final meeting together as an advisory committee. We'll be looking at a series of updated draft rules based on comments we've been hearing from work groups and what we talk about today. And then the next couple of weeks, we'll be working on updated rules. And then we also have impact statements that are required to be reviewed by the advisory committee as part of the rulemaking process. It's part of the law about how agencies do administrative rulemaking. So those will be reviewed also, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss those impact statements as an advisory committee in January. In just a few weeks after that, in February, the Land Conservation Development Commission will be talking about this one more time before they start in the official hearing processes. They'll review the draft rules and impact statements that we'll be looking at in the advisory committee meeting in January. And we may have a few outstanding questions depending on how meeting today and our next meetings go. In terms of, there may be some outstanding questions that we would like the commission to weigh in before we begin the hearings. Hearings will begin in March, or end of March, early April, is when their meeting is scheduled. And so we'll see exactly what day that lands on, but that will be the first official hearing to really start the rulemaking. There'll be, a notice. There's all sorts of legal requirements up ahead of that, but that will be their first hearing. Well, they will take written and oral testimony, and then the commission will have a final hearing and ideally adopt the rules in May. All along the way, there may be tweaks that need to be made to the rules, and that's okay all the way up until the rules are actually adopted by the commission in May. So unless there's any questions on the schedule, I'm going to go ahead and give a quick update on what we've been up to since the last time we met with you. We've been pretty busy. We've had 4 different community conversations. These are meetings that have been open to members of the public. We kind of group them in geographic groups, very well attended. We have one of them is on our YouTube site, I believe, if I remember correctly. We didn't put all of them up there, but so there's a kind of a presentation that's a little bit more public focused, and then an opportunity to have discussion and questions, and those went pretty well. We've additionally, up until yesterday, have been holding 6 practitioner roundtables around the state. Those are aimed at planners, city managers, folks like that, who are going to be implementing these rules at local governments. And those, again, we're geographically focused around the state, and have been. I think we really were able to get down to brass tacks in a lot of those meetings on some of the details of things that worked and didn't work, and we'll be taking a lot of those ideas and questions and comments and rolling those into the next version of rules that you see. In addition, we held 5 topic-specific work groups, and we'll be talking later this meeting about the reports out from those and what we learned specifically coming out of those. We figured out that there's 3 of those that we're going to meet again soon, and you should have gotten an email just yesterday about when those are going to be, but we'll highlight those in this presentation as well later on when we talk about the work groups. So those were topic specific, and again, we were able to get a range of folks on the advisory committee, some folks that were not on the advisory committee, to really focus on what do we need to do, what tweaks do we still need to make, what changes do we need to make to the rules to make them work. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And I just want to say we've made a number of other presentations and held other meetings with folks in the last few months and throughout the process, of course. But this week and the week before, I mean, my schedule has been more full than it's been this whole time. It's been pretty running to and from. So if anyone had any questions about that, happy to answer that. Otherwise, I think we'll just go ahead. I'll hand it back over to Sylvia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Bill. All right, any other DLCD updates? All right, then let's go ahead and get to our next topic. So talking about how the draft rules respond to the equitable outcome statement, and I'll hand it over to Evan and Kevin to kick us off here.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good morning. Evan Manville, he, him pronouns. Next slide. So we were asked by the commission to reflect on how we'd used our statement in developing our rules and what we brought forward. And we want to applaud all the work of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. It feels like forever ago that we went through 5 drafts of the Equitable Outcome Statement, but with your help, we honed it and crafted it, and it was super useful. And so we did that exercise per the Commission's request. And the great thing was we were able to take things directly from the statement and move it directly into rule language, or conceptually into rule language. So we're going to go over that. At the end, we're going to ask you all where we fell short, where we may need more work, or plaudits for actually doing it. We accept those as well. But as noted in a previous RAC meeting, we did want to note to start the equity process. We understand the process is a core part of equity. And we distributed a memo and a second memo here. So we really are working to reflect the language you gave us or crafted with us about centering the voices of underserved populations in ongoing land use and transportation processes, to really include intersectionality, value qualitative data as well as quantitative data, and really bring that forward. So those are in the draft rules in the sections mentioned. The I didn't want to have all 12 numbers, so it's not OAR 660-012-0125. All these that are 4 numbers are just the 012s, the core transportation rules that you're looking at. When I have more than 4 numbers, that's like division 44 under the second one, 44-0100. So yeah, so we pretty much took your recommendations on centering the voices and prioritizing community-led engagement, and we're asking local governments to do that. Next slide. So again, recommendations from you all about making sure we recognize past harms and do that as part of the analysis and work to redress those. Make sure that our public processes are accessible to the diversity of Oregonians and their needs and communication styles. And try to do some work regionally. So scenario planning is the main way that we focus on regional stuff and try to facilitate regional cooperation. Next slide. So I apologize for the text-heavy slides, but we did want to make sure that this goal from the Equitable Outcome Statement, where we're looking at how we're affecting folks, is kind of throughout the rules. So we're really trying to make sure governments double check their work, think about it as they're making this, figuring out where climate-friendly areas might be, and how their transportation plans and land use plans are amended, including, of course, the core housing issue. Yeah, and there's also something in the housing rules and under scenario planning, really trying to make sure we're looking at the details here. And as I go, if my colleagues want to interrupt and add some details, you're welcome to, but I want to get through and give a chance to questions. Next slide. So we did that long list of underserved populations. We pretty much brought that forward into the rules and included intersectionality as part of the equity analysis. So really thinking about governments looking at those things and we're also trying to think how to help local governments do that. So we'll touch on that a little bit later in this presentation about bringing data and thinking about how do I identify and map the populations that we need to pay particular attention to because of our past practices and current discrimination and things like that. So yeah, we're really asking the equity analysis to happen as part of major transportation updates and also updated during minor transportation plan updates. So really always checking to make sure that equity analysis is there. Next slide. So a big part besides the process, of course, was the outcomes. Like process is worth not very much if you're not getting where you want to get, but it's critical. But we really these are 3 key things we identified in the outcome statement as principal outcomes for climate, which we're cutting pollution, having the place, and they're kind of in the memo that we wanted to highlight as like trying to get there as far as cutting pollution and increasing resilience, as well as having health air quality and tree canopy in parks. So yeah, there are provisions throughout that try to nod to those outcomes. You know, like climate-friendly areas is not listed here as reducing pollution, but that's obviously, you know, rulemaking as a whole is aimed towards that. Next slide. Besides climate, of course, we identified the equity outcomes, a fairly extensive list of those in the statement. And we said 3 were principal and the others were things we needed to keep in mind. Increasing stability, mainly referring to housing. There's a longer phrase in the statement, but really trying to do that as folks identify climate-friendly areas and think about displacement upfront. and policies to mitigate displacement. The transportation choices, again, that's kind of throughout the rule, but obviously with particular attention in ped, bike, and transit sections. And adequate housing. Again, Kevin's done a lot of work. I don't know if you want to say anything more about the adequate housing and access to key destinations and needs.
You know, I don't need to go into a lot of detail. We'll talk about climate friendly areas a little bit later, but certainly the anti-displacement work is important, but also the idea that we make sure we're making space for everyone to have an opportunity to live in a climate friendly area and to benefit from the larger benefits to the local government.
Right. Next slide. So we had these other outcomes that we weren't sure that the rules would focus on, but should keep in mind, or weren't principal. Things, increased safety for folks who put in vulnerable conditions and better health outcomes. We definitely see that as a co-benefit of a lot of the rules. Access to parks and nature. We had done this effort on identifying key destinations and really trying to make sure that we have provisions in various parts of the rules to increase access to those key destinations. So these are identified as key destinations, nudging local governments to prioritize investments to those. The remedying impacts, we're asking local governments to look at factors in decisions and recognizing that the impacts are past inequities. And the fairly distributed benefits, again, in various places in the rules. This is one place in the housing rules, kind of trying to make sure that climate friendly area for everyone in Oregon. They're not just for the wealthy and privileged. Next slide. We had at the end of the equitable outcome statement, we had some things that didn't necessarily fit in, or it was hard to figure out where to put them. But we did things that we wanted to daylight and make sure that hey, this isn't just words on paper, that we do have the resources to make it happen and good information, and we make decisions aligned with that. So we talked a fair amount about trying to get communities resources with our state government partners, improve information through equity mapping, and making sure that as the investment decisions are made, that we think about the factors statement, that really we're asked to prioritize and make sure that all Oregonians are served. And the last thing about measurability and accountability, we have the reporting, including progress towards centering the voices of underserved populations. So I think that's the set of slides. I know it was a lot, but I did want to walk through it bit by bit to kind of show you how we really worked to get everything in there. But open to hearing your questions and thoughts. I do want to give Kirsten an opportunity to talk about some community-based organization engagement and RES as part of our overall process. Kirsten, do you have? Yep.
Sorry, I'm on audio in a different way just because of Zoom instability, internet instability, but good to see everyone. Thanks for opportunity to just give a brief update here. We're really excited. There's a new protocol out from the governor's office to help implement the governor's August updated diversity, equity, and inclusion and racial justice action strategy. I can put that document in the chat. It's a very important document for our state and for all that work for the state, and by association, our rulemaking process, etc. So what it does, and it is wonderful, requires all local governments to attend to racial justice in their budget development processes. And so we are hoping to add that topic to our closeout interviews with some of the community-based organizations that have been serving on this RAC. So please and thank you in advance. That would be in February. And then also we hope to host a come one, come all equity focused meeting of this RAC and other folks listening, and actually constituents and those interested from our related state agencies, Oregon Health Authority, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and others have some we have some overlapping stakeholders and people interested in public health outcomes, as well as racial justice and environmental equity. So that will be a sort of a more come one, come all invite in February as well, meeting via the internet probably still, or at least a hybrid. I'm not sure where we're going with Omicron, but I don't have any confidence we'll be doing in-person meetings in February. And then a survey of local government partners that would supplement the practitioner meetings and the guidance that we've heard on the RAC and through your surveys about what local governments need in terms of our policy option package or budget request for the next legislative session to continue to implement this work. So that's a lot of words, but I'll help review the meeting summary on this, Sylvia, to make sure that that all comes across straight. So that'll be in the summary, but also we'll be sending additional updates to RAC members directly about that process in February. Thanks, Evan. Our budget requests are due to the governor's office at the end of April, basically. So we'll be doing this work in the first quarter of 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten and Evan. All right, I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes here to dive into any questions or thoughts that you all have. So any questions on what Evan presented here or Kirsten's update? And really, I think Evan posed the questions really well earlier on of looking at how the draft rules address equity. Do they fall short? Is there more work needed? Do you have any suggestions for how the rules can better meet the equitable outcomes statement that you all helped craft earlier in this process? So any questions, thoughts, feel free to raise your hand and try to get a queue going. I think I see a hand up from Samantha. And Samantha, are you joining us as a RAC member or alternate? Oh, and you're on mute.
Sorry, you'd think I would have that figured out by now. Can you all see me and hear me fine? I'm having some Zoom problems, so I'm going to try to stay off video as much as possible. I'm joining as a RAC member. I'm Samantha Bear. I'm the housing director for the Oregon Home Builders Association. This will be my first time being able to actually be with you all in person. I just started in November. I have a quick question and then possibly some follow-up questions on the equity outcomes chart on the equitable outcomes statement line 1, where we are talking about displacement due to gentrification from public and private investments. I'm wondering if staff could kind of elaborate on what this part means, like what displacement or possible gentrification or both are we really looking at? And then I have a follow-up question, possibly.
Sure, and thank you for the question, Samantha. I can speak to this. So yeah, what we want to make sure that we build into the process of identifying areas that will be climate friendly areas, that initial step that local governments will take is including an analysis of the specifics, a spatial analysis of those areas, essentially looking at underserved populations, looking at housing costs, looking at neighborhood typology. What are the trends in those neighborhoods? And is there potential that if there are significant zone changes, regulatory changes, is there the potential to displace by essentially making those areas more attractive for development and pricing people out? And if there is that potential, we go one step further to ask local governments to look at actions they can take to mitigate for those potential impacts. That's all part of the work that we've commissioned Dr. Lisa Bates and others at Portland State University to develop an anti-displacement, anti-gentrification toolkit And so we had an earlier workshop on that, and that is kind of one of the key things that we will be rolling out for to assist local governments in that analysis.
That's all. Okay, that's great. I have two follow-ups. One, I'll just say, I think in some areas of the state, we may already know based upon current market realities and land prices that displacement or gentrification has a high probability to occur from the rules, and we may be able to kind of suss that out already. My first question is, have any, and I'm not a local government rep, and this may have already been discussed, but have any local governments given an idea of if they'll be able to mitigate or avoid that, or any of those strategies already? Because I guess I would just say I would be a little bit concerned to put these rules into effect and say, okay, this is likely to occur, this may occur, local governments, it will be up to you to solve that problem. If we already know now that in some areas, we're not sure how that problem will be able to be solved, and maybe some strategies may be identified on the front end before adoption.
Kevin?
Yeah, I will say a number of strategies have been identified as part of that work. So that's a piece of the toolkit, if you will, and that's kind of embedded within the framework of the housing production strategy work that was done under House Bill 2003. So there are a number of tools that local governments can use, and we'll be providing more information about those options. Kirsten, did you want to add something?
Thanks, Kevin. And you're exactly right. Samantha, excuse me. I don't know how I got Ramanda out of that. RAC member Samantha. Nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us. Let's definitely chat offline. Samuel DePerio Garcia gave a webinar on this anti-displacement toolkit that was pretty well attended, but specifically too, I'm aware the city of Portland is working on some strategies. This is new for everybody. So I would consider us all a cohort in this. I mean, it is smart that we're that the Equitable Outcomes has identified this. We know it's a danger, and we're really committed. Our commission is committed to trying to learn and address this. So I just suggest that we all stay together as a cohort of learning together in this. And the intent is not to penalize local governments. There's a role for local governments, there's a role for the market, there's a role for subsidized housing, which of course is Oregon Housing and Community Services and other partners. So it is no one's cracked this nut nationally. So that we're taking it on, I think, is just, we should know that, hey, be willing to express a commitment to communities that could potentially be very negatively affected by this, that this is real for us, and we'll need their engagement too to help solve the problems. It's real. And so thank you for raising it.
Yeah, and I'll just close. I don't know if by the next RAC meeting that we'll have, or prior to adoption, if we will have an opportunity to kind of go through that toolkit to just really make sure that what we've identified is going to work and be viable for the local governments. Like I said, I'm not a local government rep. The people I represent will be, taking cues from their local jurisdictions. So I just didn't know if there will be an opportunity to go through all of that prior to adoption in more depth.
Maybe we could have that be a part of the February meeting, that I just mentioned, this sort of come one, come all, because this is, I have a feeling that this is central to really achieving our equitable outcomes, is, sort of helping keep our arms around anti-displacement strategies. So I suggest that we add that to our February meeting, and I'll make a note of that too. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, Sylvia. Kevin.
If I may just add to Samantha, I'll reach out to you directly, because there is a wealth of information that we can make available to you. And as part of the work that was done, the team at PSU actually ran some analysis, some examples. I think one was in Ontario, the other one was in Tigard. So there's some real world examples you can dig down into for how that works.
Hermiston, but close, but kind of close.
Sorry.
No worries.
Thank you. All right, see another set of hands here. So let's go to Damien and then Jay Raj. And just a reminder to say your name and kind of who you're speaking on behalf of today.
Hi, good morning. I'm Damien Cernick. I'm with the City of Bend. I'm a RAC alternate. And I have a question that's somewhat of a deep dive into the weeds, but I want to make sure I'm following. So with respect to the proposed amendments to Division 12, I'm looking at section 315 4C. And I wanted to confirm that with the designation of climate friendly areas, it looks like we've got some work to do regarding updating our plans for achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes to satisfy Division 8, 00504A through F. And I wanted to confirm is that at the designation stage, that's where we're going to be bringing that information in to consider how we're achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes with the designation of the climate friendly area. So it's not just a numbers exercise where we're showing, okay, we've got 30% of our units here, but we've done that, and here's the actions that we're proposing to take to mitigate displacement, gentrification. So that was my question.
Exactly right. The focus is upon the climate friendly area and potential impacts that might result with any zoning changes that would occur in conjunction with that. So it is a focused review. It's not a broad update to, achieving equitable housing outcomes throughout the jurisdiction.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And Jay Raj?
Hey everyone, this is Jay Raj Singh, they, he pronouns. I'm the Clackamas County Chapter Director with Unite Oregon, RAC member. So I was looking at the equitable outcome statement under 660.012.01302E. And I would like to add, or I would suggest adding not only the word value, but either gather, collect, or document, as well as value lived experience and qualitative data, not just quantitative data. I think we need to actively capture that information, specifically the stories, instead of solely relying on the numbers and quantitative data. So that's just a suggestion or recommendation I have.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Let's go to Emma and then Oriana.
Good morning, everyone. Emma Newman with the City of Springfield. I'm the Senior Transportation Planner. Clearly, a lot of work has gone into this, and there's a lot coming from the equitable outcome statement. I have two comments about concerns where we're still falling short. The first is in the section around capacity in the transportation planning rule. So it's 660 and then section 12 and then 0830. And I'm concerned that this is not fully, as written and proposed, it's not achieving the equitable outcome statement at the top of page 16 on our packet that says the second section, increased safety for people put in vulnerable conditions in public spaces, transportation, and community development. Right now, it is requiring a lot of work and authorization to build roundabouts and safety projects throughout our community. And if we're really trying to achieve this equitable outcome element that's in our statement that we spent a lot of time developing, and I think that that section of the rule needs further work to really allow safety projects to be built with ease, quickly, as efficiently and low cost as possible. My second comment is that as currently written, the prescriptive and the outcomes oriented standards for climate friendly areas for our size community, so Springfield falls into the 50,000 to 100,000 range, we would need to have either 25 dwelling units per net acre or 40 homes and jobs per net acre. That is higher than we're seeing the market support in our community right now. So effectively, if these rules were adopted as presented, that puts the moratorium on development in the areas where we want to be seeing development. And with already having our existing housing crisis, that just further pushes people out to the satellite communities, increases vehicle miles traveled. greenhouse gas emissions would increase. It's less walkable, less bikeable and transit oriented. So I think further revisions to the CFA rules are really needed to actually be able to support incremental development, building being built where it should be built and where the intention of these rules are saying we want to see it built there, but the numbers aren't lining up to support that right now based on the reality that we're seeing with the market on the ground and what Smart Growth America said in their study for our local context. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. And Oriana?
Yeah, I just want to echo the appreciation for the amount of thoughtful work that has gone into what is being presented before us today. The question I wanted to ask relates to a different aspect of safety for communities and also the goals around health. How do you see this document interacting with another state agency like Building Codes Division, where a lot of the safety associated with housing will have more to do with the insulation, access to cooling, whether buildings are designed in ways that minimize exposure to heat? Just thinking about the heat waves from last summer, I can see how this document can interact with greening and some of the things that can mitigate heat islands from an infrastructure perspective, but not so much from the building side. So help me understand what the opportunities are on that front.
Really quick, could I ask Cody Meyer to just answer whether or not Building Codes is on the interagency technical support team yet?
They're not yet, but I know we've had a lot of conversations about a lot of stuff with them, and the REACH code has been brought up numerous times. They are doing some work there. So
Oriana, thanks for the suggestion. We should probably make sure they're added to the long-term strategy team that is here to focus the other state agencies that are convened to help focus on implementation. And as you have specific suggestions, Oriana, please let us know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Oriana, Kirsten. And again, any specific suggestions or thoughts on how the rules can better address equitable outcomes are welcome through the survey or written thoughts after this meeting. I think with that we can move into the next piece unless there's anything else. All right, then I'm going to hand it over to Cody to get into the amendments for rules for the metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction targets.
thank you, Sylvia. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cody Meyer. I'm a land use transportation planner with DLCD, and just want to have a quick discussion about our bringing back Division 44, the division that sets the metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction targets and also outlines the process for the regional scenario planning. The last you saw this was way back in March, seems like a long time ago. So we, since then, have really got a lot of direct feedback from folks. A lot of you gave us, got the Word document and went through there with line by line edits. So really appreciate that. We've consulted with the commission and got feedback and comments there, and then we've also ran it past our Department of Justice legal counsel to make sure that everything that's in here is kind of straight from a legal perspective. I'll say that the big charge from the commission to start off the rulemaking was to take what was a mandatory process for the Portland metropolitan area and kind of roll that out, starting with the largest 3 metropolitan areas. So adding Eugene Springfield and Salem Kaiser metropolitan areas. Eugene Springfield from the original legislation was required to identify a scenario to meet the target, and they did so in 2015. So, our original proposal was, hey, great work, take that work and let's get that adopted and let's figure out how to implement that. And so we really have been working with staff from Eugene Springfield to say, we've heard you, you don't want to redo it. We don't want you to redo it. We want you to kind of take that and start working the plan. So we've outlined a method to do that and the financial support to help them out. The big policy shift would be saying Salem Kaiser metropolitan area, you guys have to kind of develop a work program, tell us how you want to do this. And we put in some deadlines for these 2 areas to do this work. The other big area that we were working at back in March was setting up this comprehensive performance-based planning system to say, we have these greenhouse gas reduction targets. We want to do some performance-based planning to set some goals for the actions that cities and counties can take to meet these targets. We put in some enforcement mechanisms and reporting mechanisms for all the metropolitan areas. And if you can go to the next slide, please. The big shift since this last draft you saw in March is that we have just been continuing to do this work, but we have decided, this makes more sense in Division 12 in the TPR. So in item 12 in your packet, you'll see there is a draft of the Division 44, and there will be a lot of sections that have been rule sections that have been deleted. And those didn't go away. They just are now in the 900 rules and the 0160 rule, the VMT reduction target in the transportation planning rules. So we have really fleshed out the reporting and corrective actions, how the commission would receive a report on the performance measures and setting performance targets consistent with, achieving either a scenario plan actions. We know what actions we want to take and what levels, or the statewide transportation strategy as what you would think of as like a default scenario for a region. So that's kind of the big changes that we've made. Again, we're happy to take comments on if you want a Word doc, you want to go strike through, any kind of comments generally, we're happy to talk about. And I think I'll just pause and see if there's any questions.
That's great. Thank you, Cody. Any questions or initial thoughts on that?
Kind of a lot to throw at you in a short amount of time, I realize.
Well, thank you, Cody. I think with that, we can kind of move on. And I think we're going to go to Matt and Bill to just provide a little bit of context on what DLCD has been hearing throughout the RAC process and other venues. So over to you, Matt and Bill.
Hi, Matt Kroll here on the staff at Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development. The short answer to what we have heard is a lot. We've had a huge amount of incoming testimony from RAC members. Appreciate that. A lot of specific comments. We've heard from going around to community conversations. We've heard from the Land Conservation Development Commission. We heard from a series of meetings focused regionally with local planning and from a series of meetings focused topic by topic. But some of the biggest, so that there's really no way that I can boil all of that down into a couple of bullet points and cover all of it. So it's all available. The full is in the packet that you received with pages and pages of it. But I want to hit maybe a couple of the key points that are worth discussion today, and then we can open it up to others too. You'll see on the screen there that three of the biggest kind of questions we've been hearing is something about the schedule. That's been a lot of discussion. Questions around or comments around how the funding and the assistance that local governments will be needing. And of course, this question is always coming up, the balance between how to do the outcomes-based and the prescriptive. So we'll talk about those a little bit. The first one maybe is the one that we put it on the list first because it's the one I think we hear most often, most comments on. Certainly we hear a lot of comments about urgency, need to do this faster. Why haven't you adopted these rules already? That kind of, and then these are going to take a lot of time. There's local government planning processes to do this right, to do all of the public engagement is going to take time. So those schedules need to be pushed out. So we're hearing both, sooner or later. I would suggest that for today, if there's some discussion to be had this morning, maybe we avoid the just simply push it earlier, push it later discussion. That's a decision that ultimately will have to be made by the commission. And the testimony to that can go to that, certainly. At the RAC, I think our best ability to maybe do some consensus building or maybe some brainstorming or some ideas, working on discussion here, would be to think about if there are other ways or somewhere in between that doesn't just simply involve pushing everything further forward or pulling it all sooner. We have heard suggestions that could be some flexibility in how these events are sequenced, maybe rearrange the sequence that different cities, different counties, maybe even working at a regional level, which we would really love it if there was some regional cooperation and coordination on how to sequence the various pieces of these requirements. And so if there's proposals to do that move some elements to happen sooner than we talked about in our rules, or maybe and some of the elements could go later, includes some of the elements some local governments have already got a schedule for, like a transportation system plan is already committed to being on a particular schedule, if that would fit into a sequence better. And as I mentioned, the regional coordination, it's really hard when we're writing rules covering, 8 different MPO areas to say, well, how should each one coordinate? But if the cities and counties in a particular region were to get together, talk together and say, here's our schedule. And when I say coordinated, I don't necessarily mean that everybody has to do the exact same events at the exact same time, that all the cities have to adopt a TSP on the same schedule, and they would all adopt parking on the same schedule. But certainly being aware of the ways that the different actions by specific local governments are going to affect each other, and how information from one could be available from the other, so that everybody in that region knows what the schedule is and when they're going to receive that information and how they can. And then the final thought maybe I would just share on schedule, just something to think about for local governments is, we hear a lot of people talking about, well, how many months after adoption of these rules? And I would just reframe that to say, right now we've got a pretty good draft of the rules out there, and I would encourage everybody, maybe in January when you come back from some holidays or some vacation time, there, start talking with other cities and counties in your region and coming up with an idea of what that schedule would be. And so by the time we get towards that adoption coming up in May, there's already some good discussion going on locally about how you would want to sequence those if you would think a different sequence would be appropriate. So that's probably the item that I would encourage the most discussion at this morning on our agenda. I'll hit these others kind of a little bit too. The funding question, certainly hear that, and we're continuing to get information as far as what we can commit to. I know what we want to do. There's no doubt about it that we want to provide lots of funding to local governments to do the planning and then to do the actual building of the system that comes after the planning. That's where it really is important. It's hard to make commitments at this point in that process. So we are trying to figure out how much of that we can do. But we're also hearing requests for assistance that's not necessarily monetary, but for better information, technical assistance, guidance documents. And we're cataloging all of that too. And we'll be doing some internal prioritizing to figure out what information is most valuable. So it's really useful for us to hear from the people who will be implementing this, which parts of these are most confusing, you need the most help. And then other parts of it may be like, yeah, we know how to do that. That's well established. There's lots of literature on that. We're ready to go on that part so that we can focus our efforts on where that technical assistance and guidance is most needed. And then I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say about this question of the balance, the outcome-based and the prescriptive. We certainly hear it, and we're trying to, wherever we can, provide both paths so that there is some prescription and make it easy on cities and counties that want to just, let's adopt that, it's right there, but create that flexibility for another path for a city or county that came along and said, well, we've got some other ideas. And I think we're hearing a little bit of both sometimes. Sometimes we're hearing people say, give us more flexibility, we need that outcome. We're also sometimes hearing from cities and counties, we don't know how to handle that. Your rules are too vague. We're not sure what you mean by that. Can you give us more specificity? So we're trying to find that balance, but maybe provide both paths where we can. I would open it up, I think at this point, if there's any other staff who wanted to jump in on the big things that they've been hearing or seeing, because none of us, I don't think any one of us has probably seen all of the comments that come in, but together as a team, we've had a chance to look at everything that's been coming in and try to get that. So if there's any other staff who want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just note that some more topic specific, I mean, we've got a range of comments, of course, more than just these, but we're going to be talking about the work group specific type of topics later in this meeting. So just so folks are aware.
Then Sylvia, I think would be time to turn it over to comments, questions, feedback from the whole RAC.
Yeah, absolutely. So comments, questions from the RAC. And Matt, are there any specific questions that you want to ask the RAC at this time? Reflections on any of those pieces? I heard you say that maybe a focus on the implementation schedule. Anything specific you want to ask?
That's the one that's most interesting to me right now. And I would really love to have some input and suggestions, creative brainstorming on that, but open to anything.
Just leave a little space here for questions, comments if folks have them. All right, see a hand up from Damien.
All right, thank you. So the current RAC packet for today has some discussion about timing of implementation on the top of page 4. that includes some options, one of which is a work program option for reorganizing order and completing certain actions. Is that something the project team has been thinking about? Is that something we can think about, provide you some input? Where do you see next steps in kind of fleshing that out, that idea out?
Yes, I would love to hear input, suggestions, ideas on that today or in your survey response, or both.
Yeah, and just to be clear, it is something staff is discussing seriously. The more that we've talked with local governments around the state, I think the more we understand that everyone's coming from a different place, have TSPs of different vintages, other projects that are going on, and no one's saying necessarily don't make us do all these things. I think everyone understands it's important. I think the question is, how do we actually accomplish this given the resources available and the time? And so I think this is an opportunity potentially to provide local governments, choose your own adventure. How would you like to do this work that you need to do?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know that I've got anything specific, except I think it's an idea worth looking at more closely. I'd be interested to hear, if this is something we'll be talking about later on during the report out for climate friendly areas, or if this is something I should talk more with our team at the City of Bend about, and then when we've got some ideas ready to share, send those off to you to continue that conversation.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. And Ariel? And Ariel, I think you're off mute, but we're kind of just hearing some static. All right, well, I see you went back on mute. Maybe if you have a thought, you can go ahead and send me a chat and I can provide it to the group if that works while we wait for a few more hands here. Sorry about that audio issue. I see a hand up from Heather.
Hi, I am a RAC alternate for the City of Eugene. This is my first RAC meeting. I'm replacing Chelsea Clinton, who's been our alternate and is in a new position. So thanks for providing this opportunity. Rob Innerfeld is usually here for us and he's unavailable. I just wanted to get clarification. I think I asked this in another meeting, but thought it might be helpful for the whole RAC to hear. On the piece that Damien mentioned, the possibility of submitting a work plan. There are other parts in the OARs that specifically talk about work plans, and the parking approach area, I don't think is one of them compared to the scenario planning area or provisions. And so I think I understood that staff is considering basically all of the deadlines in the provisions that are being proposed could be part of this alternate work plan. Is that right? Or yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm seeing Bill nod. Okay, that's what I thought. So that's really helpful. Thank you for considering that option. And we will talk further. We're having a little bit of challenging because we've got a lot of folks that are out of the office for the next couple of weeks. So it's been a little bit challenging being able to really dig into these, but thank you for presenting that option.
Thank you, Heather. All right, and let's try Ariel one more time here. We're still not able to hear you, unfortunately, Ariel.
Hi, Sylvia. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Perfect.
Sorry about that. Having some audio issues. Appreciate your patience. I just wanted to echo real quick what Heather said about that. We really appreciate these technical work groups. I think they've been very helpful, but the timeline with holiday schedules has been challenging. And so just wanted to flag it might be helpful to have some additional follow-ups in the new year for folks who weren't able to engage in December. But the original reason I raised my hand, just around timelines and resource, appreciate how Bill was framing and the understanding that we're going to have these conversations about, what local governments need and what time it will take to accomplish the things that have been set out in the rules. But I just want to flag that timing of the resources as well. I understand this is iterative and appreciate that there's going to be a dedicated conversation to informing the department's budget requests for resources for local governments. But even if we get all the resources that are needed and folks are feeling comfortable, the timeline of when those grants go out and the timeline of the implementation deadlines for local governments, it seems like jurisdictions are going to have to start immediately. If not, they're already kind of starting already when these rules get adopted. And by the time grants get out, by the time budgets are approved and sessions are over, the timing of those resources is not necessarily going to line up with the work that needs to be done at the local level. So I think I've heard a lot of concerns about that and just want to be aware of the connection there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ariel, so much. Let's go to Sarah.
Thanks. And I'm not sure if I may be missing nuance on this, but I just want to clarify. Can we just prioritize getting the CFAs designated first? Is that something that can be kind of built into the sequencing and really do some aggressive work to require that all plan updates promote development in those CFAs and reduce VMT? Can we just kind of set up something crude like that as kind of a timeline workout? So again, I'm not sure if that works for the nuance and the context, but that just feels like a kind of a clear way to proceed. Thanks.
I can respond briefly to that. I think as we've said, it's at a concept level at this point. Everything is on the table, but we understand and we expect that with this alternative work plan schedule, there will need to be some real thought given to the logical sequence of steps. Starting with the land use has a lot of benefits. I'm not sure where we're going to end up on that, but certainly that's going to factor into our thinking.
Thanks, Kevin and Sarah. Hey, others, any other questions, comments, thoughts on the implementation schedule or any of the other kind of overall feedback that was presented on? Okay, well, we are a little bit ahead of schedule here, but I think we should just go ahead and take our break maybe now anyway to just go along with that. Okay, people are nodding their heads. So it's about 10:04, maybe get back together at 10:15, a little more than a 10-minute break. We never get a full 10-minute break in these racks, so we get one today. So let's get back together at 10:15, and when we resume, we'll get report outs on the various work groups, starting with the transportation performance standards. So see you all in 10 minutes here at 10:15. right, welcome back, everyone. Now we're going to move into a series of report outs for the various work groups. We've got about 5 report outs here, so it'll be kind of a lightning round of about 10 minutes for each report out, and then 5 or so minutes of Q&A and thoughts for each one. And I'll turn it over to Bill first on a report out from the Transportation Performance Standards Work Group, and then we'll get into the rest after that, going to Transportation System Planning Work Group, and then Climate Friendly Areas, the Transportation Modal Planning, and Parking. So over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, again, Bill Holmstrom, DLCD staff. Yeah, like Sylvia said, these are the 5 topics we'll be going over this morning. I'm not going to be doing the talking for all of them. But we'll split them around. I just do want to highlight that we decided in a couple of these meetings that we would need some additional work. And so we're going to hold an additional meeting for these 3 the week after next. I know we're kind of in between holidays. It's a tough time, but the reason that we're doing it then is just we want to make sure that we're getting ahead of the advisory committee meeting rules that will come out in early January for our January 20th advisory committee meeting. So that's why they are the way they are, right when they are. So we're doing one for climate friendly areas. That's going to be on Monday, the 27th from 1 to 3. We're doing one for transportation system planning. That's going to be on Tuesday, December 28th from 1 to 3 p.m. And then one on transportation modal planning. That's on Wednesday, December 29th from 9 to 11 a.m. And you should have had an email already on this, and I'll repeat these again at the end of this, so you'll have a chance to take a look at that again. But let me go ahead and jump into transportation performance standards. And just to refresh folks' memories, this is about the standards that we use to measure the success of the transportation network. And almost entirely now, the standards we use in certain contexts have to do with motor vehicle congestion, or when it comes down to it, how many cars can move through an intersection during a peak hour is what a lot of these measures really come down to. It doesn't cover all the other values that are important to us in our transportation network. So we have some draft rules that talk about making sure that local jurisdictions are looking at multiple standards when they're doing decision making. So some things we heard. One key item, and this is going to be kind of a frequent refrain, is I think local governments are concerned about the timing of when these requirements would come into play. Right now, the draft rules are written that they would need to local governments would need to adopt a standard. I think by the end of 2023, if I'm correct. So about a year and a half after the rules are adopted. I think there was some good concern about, is that just kind of a random date, or does it make sense to do this in conjunction with the transportation system plan update? So we'll consider that, because it really is, you need to adopt these into the transportation system plan. It would be a transportation system plan amendment to adopt these standards, so that it probably makes sense to just to be part of that. And then when that timing happens, has to align with the resources available to be able to implement it, which kind of leads me into the next piece, which is we don't necessarily have a good handle on what other standards would be, or how they would be implemented by local governments. There's a lot of options out there. There's a lot of research on different things, and I think there's a lot of promising candidates. But in Oregon, in our state, we haven't used them yet. So I think like I think Matt was talking about earlier, it's hard for us to commit specifically. We want to just say we'll begin working on developing some resources for local governments, and I think that's going to be a key thing that we're going to do in the short term. But I don't necessarily know that what we'll be able to do, when we'll be able to do it with the resources we have available. So that we need to make sure that the work that we require of local governments lines up with what we're able to provide as a state. However, there's been a lot of promising work on this already up in the Portland metropolitan area. Recently, they've been looking at potential different performance standards that they would use in the Portland metropolitan area. And the state of California recently has changed all across the state how they measure this, and they've moved to a different standard based on vehicle miles traveled. Is extraordinarily promising, and I think it has potential application here. So we'll be looking at those efforts for sure, and trying to borrow as much as we can in helping local governments around the state develop potential other standards. One question that came up is, do we need to have two standards, or can we just, if we've got one standard that's better than what we have now, that meets the objectives that we're trying to get at? Is that possible? That's something we'll consider. I think there's a lot of kind of reasons why we arrived at two different standards, but that's certainly, I think, something that we'll take a look at. And then there's a rule 325 in Division 12 in the transportation planning rules that talks about how in climate friendly areas, review of plan amendments, which is kind of the key place in the rules where these standards come into play. How does that review work? And I think that rule just needs to be kind of fixed up a little bit, streamlined and cleaned up, so it's clear what local governments have to do, when they have to do those, both when climate areas are adopted and implemented, and then in later years when they're making changes within those climate friendly areas, because that's a different mechanism that we're proposing than the rest of the state and everywhere else that's not a climate friendly area. So with that, I think I will, we had a number of folks that participated in this work group, and if there's folks on the call today that would like to chime in and say their piece, happy to hear that. And like I said, we'll be holding another meeting in a couple weeks.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So anyone from the Transportation Performance Standards Work Group want to provide your thoughts, reflections? All right, we can also just open it up to kind of any questions on this topic. When we get into our breakouts, we can really get into more discussion on the transportation performance standards as well as the other topics that folks are going to report out on. But if there's any kind of initial questions for the group, clarifying questions, that'd be helpful to ask here. Yeah, Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you, Sylvia, and thanks, Bill. My big overarching question, and it's going to be the case for all of these, is: do you feel like you're seeing opportunities, big opportunities for common ground and achieving, maybe reconciling issues that are coming up, such as either pushing further with the standards, with implementation, or whatever the issues are that you're tackling in each of these? Are you finding more common ground? Or is it, wow, we're really going to have some tough issues to frame for the commission to make the decision one way or the other? I'm just curious at a big picture level what your thoughts are.
So I think in this topic area in particular, it really comes down to we're on board with what you're asking us to do. We just don't know how to do it. That's the message that we're hearing, and we need help to figure out what it is that you want us to do. I think for many of these rules, we've heard maybe you're being too prescriptive, maybe you're telling us too many specifics. In this rule, in 170 in particular, folks are saying you've given us a lot of flexibility, and we don't know where to go with that. There's some back and forth. I think it's going to be super important in the next year or so for the state. And it's not just going to be DLCD. We're going to have to work closely with Department of Transportation to think about what are other standards that make sense. And I think the vehicle miles traveled related standard has a lot of promise. Like I said, California has moved to that for, it's a different context with how they plan down there with the California Environmental Quality Act. It's a different than we do with our planning system, but I think there's some potential there. There are pros and cons to all of these different measures. I mean, you can look at the Metro materials. They've looked at dozens of different types of measures, and all of them have pros and cons, and have there's certain issues with implementing one over another one. So I think that's going to be the thing: is are we going to be able to provide enough resources to local governments to settle on one or more standards that will be useful and implementable for them? and when it comes down to it, with some of these changes that are legally defensible as well.
Thanks, Bill. And just, I guess the only other comment I would say is I really appreciate staff conducting these meetings over the next couple of weeks. And you identified that it's challenging over the holidays. I will just say I'm one of the commissioners that strongly supports your holding these meetings over the holidays, as difficult as they are, because we have a lot of work to do. And I can't emphasize enough, as I did in my opening remarks, we're coming to the conclusion of the rulemaking advisory committee process. And so we want as many comments as possible. So hopefully the virtual remote option provides greater flexibility for people to continue to participate. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, others, any other questions on the transportation performance standards piece? Yeah, over to you, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. So I wasn't part of this meeting, the small working group meeting that was held, but I do have a question about it. So I don't know if I'm allowed to ask now or if I've missed my opportunity. Okay, good. So from my reading of 0170, I saw that paragraph 2, that the different performance standards listing, one of the performance standards was accessibility, but it was listed as, actually, it's paragraph 3. It's listed as one of the optional performance standards. It's not required. And I'm curious how we can make that required.
So yeah, great question. I would say the list of those aren't standards themselves, right? They're, objectives that we want standards to measure or to be responsive to, and there's a whole list of them. That's going to be separate than kind of the base requirements for how a network, how facilities are built. There's base requirements for accessibility that exist no matter what. And these standards don't have an effect on those.
So how can we make it as an objective? How can we make accessibility a requirement?
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the issues that I think people are kind of scratching their heads about with our rule is what does an accessibility standard in this context look like? And I would have to, I think, do a little bit of research, maybe look at some of the Metro materials to see what they came up with, to have an example of what that even looks like. I don't know if Cody, you have any ideas for that? And accessibility can mean a broad variety of things. So it's a good question. I think we maybe need to follow up a little bit more on that one.
Okay.
Hi, Bill. Hi, everyone. This is Margie from Metro.
Thank you, Margie.
Good to see you. I've been looking in the background. Generally, we have a definition of accessibility, and I'm happy to send it in the link or send it over. But generally, it's access to places that people need to go. So we look at access to health centers, child centers. We've got new data layers on that, but we also look at access to parks, access to grocery stores, access to there's 12 different kind of categories. Schools is another category. So it's quite extensive list. And we continue to try to update our data layer set so that we have, say, for example, the most recent data layer set on daycare facilities from the counties or schools from the school districts. Does that answer your question?
I think partially. I think a longer conversation is needed for defining accessibility, and that was another comment or question that I had. I didn't see in the definitions section, that 0005, I didn't see a definition for accessibility.
Okay.
And so I think probably offline a longer conversation is needed to sort of work through that and understand what all the implications are.
Yeah, I think, and I'll just add, so we have a definition on regional transportation plan, which we'll be updating in 2023. And I'll just add that I think we need to think about accessibility differently, especially given COVID and the lockdown and how many services we're able to access virtually. And I think that's a really interesting conversation that we'll probably have as part of our 2023 RTP as well. Happy to share.
And just to respond quickly, there are, of course, COVID has exacerbated inequities for a lot of people because not everyone has computers and at home and has the time to spend, 4 hours at a DLCD meeting.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Great. And thank you so much for that, Michael. Okay, I think let's move into the next report out from the Transportation System Planning Work Group. So over to Cody Meyer for that one.
Thanks, Sylvia. So again, Cody Meyer, DLCD, and just want to give kind of what we heard from a Transportation System Planning Work Group meeting. So this work group kind of focused on how a transportation system plan kind of takes those modal elements of the transit, pedestrian elements, the different modal elements, and kind of puts those together into lists of projects. So in the TPR, you'll see draft rules 012, 200, 205, and 210. I'd say that we kind of really focused in on that, these kind of building these project lists. And we also talked a lot about, the VMT reduction targets, the kind of constraint that, the projects and TSP should be reducing VMT by, an amount to get to the greenhouse gas reduction target, or just show an overall reduction in VMT. So just kind of overall framing here is that the rules are calling for 2 project lists, and this is kind of pretty much consistent with best practices. What we've seen in a lot of newer TSPs across the state is, kind of identify what's your, what do you really need? We all know we need a lot of stuff that we can't afford. So what's the ultimate kind of build out? That's kind of an illustrative list. That's the rule 200. And then, what can you afford to build over the planning horizon? So we know that the needs are greater than the funds. So we ask that cities, counties identify what they call a financially constrained project list. So identifying the budget available over the next 25 years, and then kind of prioritizing projects to meet that. So if you can go to the next slide, we can give you the summaries of what we talked about. I think in general, we heard a lot about if the lists need to be prioritized, if this is kind of like a sequential ranking, that doesn't leave a lot of flexibility for funding sources that come. There might be got a grant and we could do some projects, but it's not on that list. It's not a number 5 priority. So to think about things in project tiers, so kind of like your high priority tier, your secondary priority tier, but that would allow local governments to kind of get a little bit more flexibility with mixing and matching projects with funding as it becomes available, because we know that, you do a transportation system plan, you don't know everything you're going to know in a year, kind of things change fast. You have an infrastructure package come to town and different things happen. So getting some just tiers of priorities there. We did hear a lot about, the need for urgent change, that we have plans that are moving in the wrong direction in a lot of cases is what folks said, and that we need to update these plans soon. And that the current draft rules of the TPR doesn't set any timelines. So there was a lot of concern that, the stuff just kind of sits there in an administrative rule and doesn't result in actionable changes on the ground. So that's something we've consistently heard, and a lot of folks have brought to the work group meeting to put some timelines there. Another thing we heard was the need for maybe some more flexibility. You have an illustrative project list that has your kind of overall wish list of things you'd like to build, but then you're hemmed in a little bit with a financially constrained list. And if examples were given, like what if a big development came to town And as a part of that development, we can get them to build a bike path. But that's not on our financially constrained list. So then we have to do a plan amendment to get these good projects built. So thinking of mechanisms in there to allow for projects to be pulled over from the illustrative list, to respond to changes on the ground when development comes, and exactions could be taken from that development. And then we had a lot of conversation about, well, okay, that sounds all well and good, but like, what are the sideboards on that? And we didn't want a backdoor for a development coming into town and building a bunch of roadway capacity improvements through that, and that would kind of defeat the purpose of the rules that are set out in reducing VMT. So that's kind of the summary there. I don't know, Bill, if you want to add anything to this portion or turn it over for discussion.
No, yeah, thank you, Cody, for covering that, and happy to answer any questions or have a discussion about it. And again, this is one of the meetings where we'll hold an additional meeting in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cody and Bill. So if there are any folks that participated in the transportation system planning work group, want to provide additional context or your insights, definitely welcome that here, or any questions from the RAC on any of these pieces. Right, well, I'm not seeing any hands up. So maybe we can move into the next topic. I think we have Kevin's going to report out on the climate friendly areas work group. So Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, so the climate friendly areas work group, we were also looking at land use requirements in section 0330, although I don't think we actually had time to get to that topic, but that's within the scope of our discussions. We met last Friday, December 10th, had a great conversation, lots of good input from folks. It was just a couple of hours. We will be meeting again on the 27th. So again, as Bill said, unfortunate timing, but necessary for us to get things shaped up for that next set of rules. We talked about a number of things. Next slide, please. In the work group, these are some highlights. First of all, we've heard input from a number of folks about the concerns that the allowed housing types within climate-friendly areas, really the current draft allows multifamily development. That's pretty much what's on the menu there. And that multifamily doesn't generally lend itself to an ownership model. It's difficult to do the condominium conversion process in under Oregon law currently, either conversion or to establish condominiums at the beginning. And so we know that home ownership is a significant part of wealth creation. We want to bolster that in climate friendly areas as we do elsewhere in the community. And so conversations on that point kind of started by thinking about bringing back allowing for attached single family as an additional housing type. So that's kind of the row house style development, which is a little easier to divide on individual properties and for people to purchase that and build wealth in that way. That's one possibility. Another suggestion, which is interesting to a lot of us, is basically to establish minimum densities in climate-friendly areas and not be as prescriptive in terms of what the allowed housing types are, so long as they're able to meet the minimum densities. Because again, we're trying to get to a certain level of intensity of development, and maybe the rules could be a little less prescriptive here if there are other housing types that might support ownership in addition to attached single family. So some of the thinking there. The next issue was housing goal consistency. And so when I say that, that's consistency with the statewide housing goal, goal 10, it's often referred to, and implementing statutes and rules under that goal, and concerns that the draft rules, the requirement for 30% of housing, which is not actually a requirement to, well, anyway, we'll get into that in a minute, could conflict with Goal 10 requirements. And so this is a really important issue that we're working through, and we hope to address better in the next draft that we have. The key issue here is distinguishing the requirement. What we're requiring in the rules is for local governments to zone to allow certain level of development in climate-friendly areas as a distinct and different action versus the process that local governments use currently and have used for many years for meeting their, basically determining their residential land needs and meeting those residential land needs. Complicated issue, but we are working through it. The CFA designation process, so that first step, which is basically identify those climate-friendly areas we're looking at, do that equity analysis. Question arose, is it a land use decision? Should it be a land use decision? The implication there is that if it is a land use decision, it's appealable. And so we have the potential there, if it's a two-step process, for kind of holding up the progress on climate-friendly areas based on appeals. So we have talked through that quite a bit. I think the solution that we've preliminarily identified would be to turn that first decision into a required, basically a required study or submittal from the local government that essentially says, these are the areas we're looking at. Here's the analysis of, you know, housing impacts that might occur, again, that anticipating potential displacement in all of that work. As a report that comes to the department, it would be also publicly reviewed. People would be able to comment on it, but not a land use decision. The land use decision comes 1 year later with a zoning decision. Another issue that came up was minimum residential densities in mixed use buildings. So if you have a mixed use development, so within one building, you might have residential and office and, you know, other uses, does it make sense to establish minimum residential densities? In that context, isn't some residential development still moving us forward towards our goals, and would setting a minimum kind of preclude that additional development? So good conversation there. We have some thoughts about some ways we might address that or provide more flexibility there. Another good contribution is building in terms of the reporting that would be happening on the production of housing units within climate-friendly areas. So that, again, is part of that housing production strategy. Reporting that would happen every 6 years within the metro region, every 8 years elsewhere in the state, including in that reporting on production of accessible dwelling units in climate-friendly areas. We discussed minimum dimensional requirements for CFAs and pros and cons of that. So continued dialogue around what makes sense there. Potentially, one of the solutions that was described, maybe focusing on a minimum area instead, or allowing exceptions for, say, geographic or built obstacles or impediments. And then lastly, as we talked through green infrastructure requirements, employment incentives, because we're also trying to allow for employment opportunities in climate-friendly areas. It's challenging to put those details in rule, and I think the consensus of the group there was to address those in guidance that follows adoption of the rules. So that's kind of a brief overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions or whatnot.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. All right, let's get some questions answered here. So Jana, I see your hand up.
Thank you. And I apologize that I was traveling when you had that work group meeting, was unable to participate. But one of the questions that came up in our initial discussion about developing these climate-friendly communities revolved around road design in and out of those communities. And I'm concerned about limited access for everything from getting moving trucks in and out of those areas to if you've got mixed use development, I assume you're going to have retail operations going as well. And so you need to be able to accommodate trucking's ability to get in and out and provide goods and move people in and out. And so that was just one of my concerns as I heard the discussion initially, and I didn't get to hear that discussion in your work group. So I didn't know if that had come up.
You know, that's a good question, Jana. It hasn't come up in great detail at this time. And so I guess I would ask if there are specifics in rule language regarding transportation improvement requirements in climate-friendly areas. That would be very helpful. We would appreciate that input.
Maybe we could talk offline, Kevin, because
sure, happy to do that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jana. And see hands up from Samantha and Jonathan. So Samantha, over to you.
I just want to take the opportunity to thank Kevin and the department on how much they have taken feedback on this and have worked with us and are really diving into addressing these concerns head on. It's really challenging because we have two very important goals. We have goals for climate and we have goals for housing that are both prioritized in the state. And sometimes it's hard to reconcile both of those. And so I just want to say, I really have appreciated how much Kevin and the staff have listened specifically to our concerns about home ownership and allowing housing type and housing choice within the CFAs. And I know we're making a lot of progress and we have another work group. And I just want to encourage the staff to continue allowing as much time as possible as much time as we need to make sure that we've worked through these concerns prior to adoption. Because I think from our end, we do see that if we don't get through these problems correctly, there are a lot of consequences for communities of color, first-time home buyers, single income households on their journey to home ownership if they want to live within CFAs. And so again, just wanted to thank the department for just allowing a really transparent and robust discussion when it's a difficult topic to address, and we're just really appreciative of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. And Jonathan?
Yes, again, Jonathan Harker. I'm a RAC member representing the Oregon American Planning Association. I was on the work group. And again, I also would want to thank DLCD staff for holding the meetings and listening to us. I wanted to comment on the CFA designation discussion a little bit, because we did talk about the idea of having a report. I'm not sure that we reached consensus on that necessarily. We also talked about the idea of, instead of having a two-step process, make the designation and the land use pieces that have to be put in place before the designation means anything kind of be in one process, one land use process. That might be more efficient for the cities to be able to do the work, do the public engagement that's going to be required for the equitable communities work. Just do that all as part of a regular planning project rather than trying to do it two steps. And so I think that's one of the things that I wanted to bring up for the RAC, is that kind of concept of a single land use process rather than a two-step process. Thanks.
And thank you, Jonathan, for that clarification. I think, yeah, I think I said consensus and I kind of went a little too far there. So I appreciate your clarification.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that was happening, and I just wanted to make sure, I just wanted to bring that up idea because I think it's a good idea to think of.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Commissioner, did you have a thought specifically on that you wanted to jump in on?
No, a separate one regarding Ms. Jarvis's comment, but I'm happy to defer to Damien first, if that's helpful.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Damien.
All right, thank you. I wanted to go back to the slide regarding the discussion on CFAs, and I appreciate raising everybody's awareness to the part about economic incentives, but I also want to add on to that a reminder that we'll need some technical guidance with respect to how to incorporate our planning for employment lands under Goal 9 and our future work on economic opportunities analysis, and how that incorporates climate-friendly areas. Because I think there's already, with this project, there's a relationship between CFAs, Goal 10, and how that work is merged with your a local government's work on our housing capacity analysis. So, recognize that that's not part of our scope now, but I wanted to put out the reminder without making it a beating a dead horse reminder to don't forget Goal 9 when we go forward, and we'll need that technical guidance as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. That's a very important point.
Thanks for that. And Commissioner Lilac.
Thank you. I appreciate Ms. Jarvis raising the question about truck and freight traffic in and out of these climate-friendly areas, particularly with the density and increased intensity of activity. I think about it similarly, but from the Southern and Central Oregon perspective with wildfires. We need accessibility in and out of these areas. And I hear this regularly from our residents who support narrow streets and reduce parking. And there's a lot of things that people support, but at the same time, we need to have safe access to and from these dense areas. And I think the same is going to be true for other regions with increasing threats of other natural disasters. So not aiming to overbuild the road network, but by the same token, we sure have to make sure it's safe. So I just hope Ms. Jarvis and Kevin, you can include that in your conversation too, because it's an important topic. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, see a hand up from Al and then Paul. So go ahead, Al.
Thank you, Sylvia. I just wanted to say to Kevin that you did a good job with your summary. I really appreciate your patience with all of us, and maybe especially with me. I'd like to go back to that slide for just a moment and talk about the first two items on it very briefly, if we could. Thanks, Kevin. So the first one is allow more home ownership opportunities in CFAs. The second is housing goal consistency and impact of the 30% requirement of other housing. On the first one, when you put those two together, there's a third concern that emerges, which is really about being sure to preserve the focus of the housing goal on home ownership opportunities throughout our existing urban areas inside our urban growth boundaries. And my concern with the 30% requirement and the way in which it seems to potentially impact the housing production strategy and the performance standards is that it is going to have the effect of allocating need to already impacted areas where we've already got a long history of adverse impacts on underserved and communities, and it will disincentivize jurisdictions from continuing to pursue the Goal 10 requirement of access to affordable housing ownership as well as rental opportunities throughout CFAs. And so I'm on two other committees. They're not actually advisory committees. One is the Housing Production Strategy Group that the Commission has just put together. And we're looking at reports to the legislature on and looking at what other jurisdictions have done. And I just wanted to note that the statutory objectives of the California Regional Housing Needs Analysis include allocating a lower proportion of housing need to an income category when a jurisdiction already has a disproportionately high share of households in that income category. And its fifth one is to affirmatively further fair housing by taking meaningful actions to overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. I like almost everything that this rulemaking is doing, but I really think there is a both and solution that will allow us to focus on dealing with past harm as well as the potential future harm that might happen as a result of the CFA project. So I'm really grateful that you've scheduled another work group meeting. I'm going to try to come up with some language that basically adjusts the accounting perhaps in a way that it eliminates any potential conflicts between what we're doing here and what we also want to accomplish under the housing production strategy and the housing goal. So thanks for letting me take that time.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Al. And Paul, over to you.
Thank you and good morning. This is Paul Thompson, Lane Council of Governments, but I serve on this RAC as Emma's alternate for the city of Springfield. Emma and I are tag teaming this morning, and as a matter of fact, I have to tag team out right after this for another meeting. 3 things real quick on the CFAs. One is we still are concerned about the 1,000-foot minimum dimension in any direction. And we know it's been mentioned several times, but we haven't heard any response to that unless we've missed something. We still think that 1,000-foot minimum is unworkable. And especially when we're talking about high capacity transit corridors and the like. So just wondering if there's any update on that. Second, the city of Springfield, and not to speak for them, but partner over in city of Eugene, has concerns around planning and engagement fatigue in CFAs with all of these requirements, all of this work, and corresponding to that, a feeling of planning neglect in other areas. In the refinement plan areas in particular, there's been a lot of planning that's happened in both cities in areas that would likely or could potentially become CFAs. And the city is just concerned about fatigue happening and not getting the sort of engagement and cooperation or partnership with the citizens and others that we might otherwise get. And then the final thing to mention real quick is need more flexibility so that previous planning work can be built upon and not redone. For instance, the city of Springfield feels that the requirements in CFAs would essentially force all of the development, residential development, to be HDR and would essentially eliminate the possibility of building any MDR in the city because it would all need to be concentrated as high density HDR within their CFAs. And so just a concern there. Hopefully I've conveyed that correctly.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate the input. I think in all areas at this point in the game, if you have specific proposals for how we might address some of these issues, that would be most helpful. But I hear what you're saying, and I will continue to work on these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And Jeremy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I do want to thank Kevin for doing an excellent job facilitating the discussion at the meeting last week and summarizing it here. And these are difficult issues. We're also really focused on those first 2 points around homeownership and just the consistency of this effort with Goal 10 and House Bill 2003 and the housing needs analysis that have been identified and how we actually produce those units over time. And one thing I just wanted to raise on that is that and this relates back to a comment Emma made earlier, where she said that, the rules as currently constructed would, essentially amount to a moratorium on development and CFAs in Springfield because the types of development that would actually occur on the ground there just, based on market realities, just wouldn't be consistent with these rules. And so I think as we're looking at the consistency of this effort and these rules with Goal 10 and House Bill 2003 and the related efforts is not just the 30% issue, but we've really got to figure out how the particular rules, whether the prescriptive version or the or the outcomes-based version actually relates to the situation on the ground in these communities that are impacted, and sort of what the likely market reaction will be, and likely market reality development opportunities are. Because the last thing we'd want to do is zone for all of this increased density with the hope that it comes, but not sort of ground truth that with what actually is going to happen, and end up with less development and less opportunities to meet the diverse housing needs that we have. So I know that, I'm not the first time that I'm saying this, or others have said it, but I just wanted to put an emphasis on that, and look forward to the further discussions in the work groups about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Jeremy. And just a reminder to folks, we'll have more time to talk about the climate friendly areas when we get into breakouts after the next couple of report outs. So if you have other thoughts that you weren't able to share right now, we'll have time there. So with that, let's move into the next report out on the transportation modal planning work group from Bill.
Yeah, thank you. Again, all right. So transportation modal planning, this is the section of the rules that have to do with the particular modes of transportation and how we plan for them. That's the pedestrian, bicycle, public transportation, and the street and motor vehicle networks that need to be planned for in the transportation system plan, and what those look like. And so I'll just go into it. This is one of 3 meetings. We'll be holding another follow-up advisory or work session on this in a couple weeks here. Range of issues, I would say. I've tried to boil it down into a couple bullet points. I'm sure folks that were at that meeting will have other specific things that they'll want to talk about as well here in a few minutes. But just real quickly, I think there's a concern with, in particular, with some of the specificity that's in the rules about what the minimum requirements are for facilities in particular places and to particular types of facilities. And there were some examples that we were given of where some additional flexibility would be necessary or useful in order to make things work. So we're open to making some tweaks there. And frankly, the rules, if you were able to look at kind of the original version of it to where we've come now, they've moved a lot in that direction already of adding more flexibility and being less specific. But it's a little bit runs up against the next bullet, which is I think there's concerns that are the rules strong enough? Do we do enough to say we're moving in a different direction? In the future, we expect fewer trips to be made by people who are driving in their car, and more trips to be made by people who are walking, using a mobility device, using a bicycle or other kind of micro-mobility vehicle, or taking transit. That's the direction we have to go. That's the point of this rulemaking, right? Is that we're building places where it's easy and likely impossible for more of those trips to happen, and we're building the infrastructure to match that. So are the rules strong enough? And this came up a lot, particularly in the bicycle section. I would say was the peak of the interest in terms of, are we doing enough in the rules? And so, yeah, that runs up against, like, we can say specifically, you need to have high quality bike facilities in these places. That's maybe too specific, but also we want to make sure that we have high quality bicycle infrastructure everywhere and have a network that connects to key places, because otherwise people aren't going to ride bicycles enough. We know from the data that you build a high quality bicycle network, that's what's going to get people of all ages and abilities on bicycles and riding around using that facility to meet their daily needs. So that'll be an interesting continuing conversation to figure out how we're going to tackle that. And then I think a topic that also came up in our streets and highways section, we do have a rule 830, which talks about when we are adding capacity to the street system, that we take a different step and really think about whether that's necessary, and if additional or other types of actions or facilities might help meet the needs instead of doing that. And I think there's a lot of good points about, are we casting too wide of net here? And Emma just brought this up earlier in this meeting, and she's mentioned a couple times roundabouts that that might be a type of intersection treatment that we could exclude from this type of authorization process. It's a good example of one, and maybe some just kind of smaller, simpler facilities where you don't necessarily need to jump through the additional hoops. But we do want to make sure that we're maintaining something like this to make sure we're really stopping and changing the way that we've done business for the last few decades, because the way we're going is not working. We need to make sure that we're changing the way that people are able to get around, giving them more options. And so, we're trying to make that balance between something that's workable, doable, that things that need to get done can get done without putting a lot of extra hurdles in them, but also that we're doing the right things for our climate and equity goals. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or have a conversation about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Bill. So open it up to anyone that was part of the transportation modal planning work group to provide additional thoughts, reflections, or just any questions from RAC members. All right, I'm not seeing any hands up. So I think I will turn it over to Evan to do the last report out from the parking work group.
Thank you, Sylvia. And I know I was breaking up a little earlier. If I'm breaking up, wave and I'll go plug in. Next, so parking reform, next slide. We had a healthy group. I'm breaking up. Okay, Emma's waving her hand.
Maybe first, oh, Emma was waving her hand for that reason. Okay.
Maybe she would. Okay. So this will not interrupt over here. Okay. We had a healthy group of practitioners and non-local government folks join us, particularly Salem, Eugene, and Springfield. Did it. We went through all the rules section by section, and here were some of the things we heard. First, there was an interest in adding to the parking maximums language. The parking maximums language in the draft rule focused just on residential didn't feel sufficient, that people were concerned that commercial is often the place that egregiously overbuilds parking. So work to do thinking through that. There wasn't any support for the draft exemption proposal that I put in response to some of the things we'd been hearing concerns about how parking in narrow streets work, but didn't hear that in this working group. There was some request to relook at the electric vehicle costs and the conduit versus the service capacity. And there was continued interest and curiosity in exactly how the unbundling, unburdening, the splitting off of parking from retail and commercial would work in practice, how cities have done that and their experience with that. We heard a little bit of, sorry, I forgot to mention Hillsborough was also there. There was some desire for exceptions to the parking for safety or other concerns. And some note from practitioners that one of the provisions allowing people to do off-site parking and on-street parking, that some of those are hard to enforce. There wasn't a push to change them, but it was just kind of an acknowledgement from practitioners that yeah, sometimes enforcement is a challenge with those. Yes, so the on-street parking is, as I mentioned in the previous bullet, some uncertainty about whether that provision should stay. Again, trying to figure out exactly, okay, if it's on-street parking, that's the public realm was the argument versus private development, and we shouldn't conflate the two. lastly, there were two other things. One is a provision that allows transit-oriented development, redevelopment of parking spaces if for transit-oriented development, and kind of that was kind of buried in a big paragraph, and pulling that apart and being really clear that that's what we're trying to allow, and a desire to further strengthen the provisions around tree canopy and parking lots. So those were some of the highlights that we heard. There were other details about terminology and meters, meters not being inclusive enough as a term for how people pay for parking these days, apps and other stuff. So yeah, happy to have people add on who were there, or questions from who weren't there.
Perfect. Thank you, Evan. And actually, before we get into the parking questions and discussion, Emma's hand up earlier was actually on the transportation modal planning piece. So Emma, do you want to ask your question? Then we'll move into the parking.
Thank you. Emma Damien with City of Springfield again. My question is in relation to the 0830 section about the capacity piece. And I have one question and one potential suggestion. The question is whether it would apply to the state and ODOT facilities and their planning processes. And then the comment, I think I was speaking with Julie Warnke with City of Salem. I'm not sure that she's on today. And if she is, by all means, feel free to chime in and speak up as well. But my understanding is that the City of Salem has a definition of added capacity that is a threshold of half a mile of general purpose travel lane. And so I'd like to consider a definition that's either that or similar to that, that determines what a capacity addition is and allows for some of the safety projects that are really important to achieving the equitable outcomes statement that I referenced earlier.
Yeah, thank you for those two questions. I'll answer the first one about ODOT facilities. So just to be clear, everything the state agencies do have to be consistent with the local comprehensive plans. So if ODOT wants to build a facility, that needs to be consistent with the local transportation system plan. And that means that if they're building a facility that would trigger that 830 review, that 830 review would need to be completed before it was added to the local transportation system plan. So it's my understanding, and when I've talked with ODOT folks about this, I think they're on the same page, that ODOT generally would do that work on behalf of local governments for when that's necessary to complete an ODOT facility, just like they do that for other items that need to happen in order to get projects off, whether it's NEPA or other things. So that's how I think that piece would work. Your other piece about thresholds, I think that, we can talk about where maybe next couple weeks from now about where those thresholds might be. Half a mile seems long to me, but something like that where it's either a distance or size or cost, or there's a threshold there that lets kind of those smaller type projects through, that we're not holding up things like that. I think is something we could look at for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that there are some limited locations where adding a brief lane can actually reduce motor vehicle idling by quite a lot. And that can help achieve some of the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals that we're striving for.
Thank you for that, Emma. All right, then let's go back to the parking topic. So welcome any thoughts from folks that were part of the parking work group, or any questions, and see a hand up from Jana. So let's start with Jana.
Thank you. And actually, Sylvia, I have almost the same question for both the modal section that Bill presented and the parking section, and that is the concept of safety. I can tell you from working with on the Portland Freight Committee and working with the City of Portland, the concept under the modal section where all streets have to serve all purposes has created some really serious safety considerations from time to time. And I will give you the best example I have was this idea that whenever a road had to be expanded or repaired, you needed to add a bike lane, which sounds great in concept until you run that bike lane across the entranceway to Northwest Container where over 800 large trucks go in and out every single day. And that was a huge concern. And so I'm hoping that we can get to the point where our planning can take some of those kinds where heavy commercial traffic is, take some of those into consideration so we don't create safety problems going forward. And I think on the parking issue, the same thing happens there. If I wasn't sure I caught your statement correctly, Evan, but you talked, I thought you said about commercial parking being overbuilt. I can tell you from my members that are trying to deliver into urban centers, in many cases, not having enough places to park their truck to unload their goods is a huge issue for them and creates not only safety hazards for the driver who's there, but for others that are trying to move, if there's no place to park, what we've all seen what happens. They park in a lane and then everybody's moving around them. And so I'm hoping that we will keep the needs of commercial goods moving in and out of both offices and retail outlets in consideration so that we create the capacity for the trucks to be able to deliver goods to them. So both from a safety standpoint is my concern. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jana. And Ariel?
Thanks. Can you hear me, Sylvia?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I would just want to echo Jana's safety cautions, particularly when it comes to the tools that are available in these rules for local governments to regulate the right of way. And we think about these entrance and exit points and high traffic points and intersections with bikes and pedestrians. But also wanted to add, when thinking about parking, certainly understand, the whole goal here is to move away from overbuilding parking and move away from cars. But, also want to recognize that, these rules, of course, are the direction we want to go, but the switch isn't going to flip overnight, right? Folks are still going to be in cars for some time. The transition to transit and to other modes of transportation, of course, takes time. And so in some of our conversations with other stakeholder partners, an affordable housing developer in the metro area raised, is there going to be some flexibility to accommodate and allow for, she gave an example in one of her recent affordable housing developments where they, they're keeping parking minimal at their development, but recognizing that their residents absolutely still drive and rely on cars and can't rely on transit where they're at. But they've got a parking agreement with a nearby, I don't know if it's a mall or a commercial development where the parking there is overbuilt and underutilized. And so that's their near-term parking plan. And so are flexible, creative ideas like that going to be possible? And just wanted to make sure that there's a recognition that parking is still needed, and that, the affordable housing development and lower income people absolutely still drive cars and can't always rely on transit in any given community. So just wanted to put that out there. Thanks.
No, I appreciate that, Ariel. Yeah, shared parking and creative solutions are very much part of the rules. They actually require communities to consider and encourage shared parking, because that's a great example you gave. The traditional example is a coffee shop and a movie theater that have kind of different times of day they need the parking. So very much appreciate that. And there's nothing in the draft rules that would stop folks from building parking. So certainly acknowledge that most households still drive, and the parking rules would apply marginally to development as it's built. So it's a long-term shift.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ariel and Evan. All right, see a hand up from Heather.
Yeah, this is definitely not my area of expertise, so I'm kind of sharing some feedback we've received from other staff. And Evan, we just want to thank you. We gave you some additional comments after the working meeting, as well to Kevin. Thanks for your responses. I think that was really helpful. We're still like I said, with staff being out, it's a little bit difficult right now to dig into the research that you provided for the documentation regarding 0450 and the parking pricing. I think we've been vocal about our concerns about the parking pricing, how that's going to work, staffing to support that concept. So I've just, thank you for the information. At this point, I think we still have concerns about that. And just trying to figure out how we would make it work. Do we have the resources, that sort of thing, because it's more of a city-wide approach, understanding that it's an option. We don't have to do that. There are other options, but just still trying to understand if this is a viable option for us. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, appreciate your engagement both at the work group and ongoing. Appreciate the ongoing conversations about that.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. All right. Well, in a minute, we can get into our breakout rooms to continue the conversation on just all of these 5 topics that you just heard report outs for. We want to have a conversation and see how this is landing for you, and just anything else you want to communicate to DLCD and the work groups as they continue to revise the rules for these areas. We are ahead of schedule, so I might just suggest we take a quick break before we get into our breakouts, but did you want to provide some more context before we do that? I see the slide just went up.
No, this is just I'm repeating the slide on when the upcoming work groups are, so folks are aware of which meetings those are and when they are. Thank you, everybody.
Bill, if I could just add, I don't know if we mentioned it, but the DLCD has a YouTube channel, which has recordings of all the previous work groups. They're streamed live and then cataloged there. So you can just search DLCD YouTube. It's probably the world's most boring YouTube channel, but if you missed a work group and want to tune into that, that's
get the popcorn. Yeah, go.
That's great. All right, thank you for that. Well, let's go ahead and take a break and get back together at 11:30. And when we do, we'll break up into breakout rooms and have about half an hour in the breakout rooms to talk more about these rules topics. So go ahead and stay on mute, turn off your video, and we'll see you at 11:30. All right, welcome back, everyone. Okay, so in a minute, we're going to get into our breakout rooms here for about 30 minutes of discussion. And when we get into our breakout rooms, we really just want to reflect on all of these pieces that you just heard about in the report outs. And I'm just going to share my screen with the questions for just a second so that we're all on the same page. All right, so when we get into the breakouts, we really just want to, focus on the kind of the 5 topics that you just heard about. So for the transportation performance standards, the transportation system planning, and the modal planning rules, but what do you want DLCD to know as they revise the rules? Just really what comes to mind for you. And then for the climate friendly areas, is there anything that you particularly agree or disagree with that you want to provide your comments on? And do you have any alternatives? So specifically, if there's something that's really not landing correctly for you, it's always helpful to know specifically what would you propose instead of that to kind of meet the needs of the effort. And then focusing on parking reform and EV charging, again, just any suggestions you have to improve the draft rules there. So as you see, it's a pretty open-ended conversation, and we'll just look to RAC members for any questions, comments you want to provide on those topics. So when we get into breakout rooms, Ingrid will be assigning people, and Ingrid will stay in this kind of plenary room to help anyone that gets lost or needs help. And I think we'll have about until 12:05 for our conversation, and then we'll come back into the large group for report outs. So in your small groups, just remember to try to identify someone to report out. And when you get back to report out, really, we're looking for it to be low key. You don't need to remember everything that was said, just 2 or 3 highlights from your group. People are taking notes, the breakout rooms are recorded, so we have all of the detailed information for staff to use moving forward. So I think with that, staff knows, who's the leader and who's taken notes. So Ingrid, I will hand it over to you to do your magic and bring us into our breakout rooms, and then bring us back at 12:05. And you can just click the blue join button when it pops up on your screen. And see you all soon. All right, welcome back, everyone. I think we've got everyone back in the room. We were cut off just a little bit in our conversation. I don't know about you all, but that was a really helpful conversation. So let's get into our report outs. And again, really just needing to highlight a couple of key themes. No need to really go over everything that was said in your breakout room. I'm sure you had robust discussions, but we'll start with room 1, which was my room. And we have Heather reporting out on behalf of our room, and then we'll go to Cody and Brian's room. I'm sorry, Cody's room, and then Matt Krall's room, then Bill's room, and then Evan's room. All right, so Heather, over to you to report out, and hopefully those notes made their way over to you, okay?
Yes, thank you. So for transportation and parking rules, we heard important to create flexibility in the system and considering passage and commercial vehicle needs, not just residential needs, which seem to be the focus to date. Concern about discouraging vehicle ownership and making it too expensive to drive. Driving is not going away, even if cars are running on alternate fuels or our EVs. Climate-friendly areas avoid one-size-fits-all and encourage home ownership in CFAs, and lots of discussion about the need to make sure we're not inhibiting a diversity of housing types, maybe providing more incentives and removing barriers to affordable housing within the OARs. And incentivizing efficient housing, for instance, like manufactured homes, which can meet higher density needs without being multifamily. And then finally, 2 concerns about the potential negative impacts on affordability for homes, particularly in the CFAs, wanting to make sure that the rules aren't doing that, and discussion about engagement fatigue and allowing jurisdictions to streamline their or couple their engagement requirements throughout all the different deadlines.
Thank you, Heather. All right, and Cody, from your room?
Yeah, Damien couldn't quite step back fast enough, so he volunteered for reporting out. Thanks, Damien.
I learned my lesson now. Thanks, Cody. So from group 2, with respect to transportation planning for climate-friendly communities, we had a good discussion regarding considering modes of travel, the appropriate networks, so people can make good choices safe choices about getting from A to B, and remembering to have at the same time parallel routes, so that, for example, if we're prioritizing one route for bike ped transit, that there's clear routes for people who are traveling by car or moving freight. We also spent some time with CFAs, reinforcing the need to make sure that we can plan for needed housing in these areas so that it's successful, considering what families will need if they live in these climate-friendly areas. And then finally, kind of overall, the need for some follow-up flexibility, making adjustments as we go, looking at case studies so that they can help guide local decision-making, and then just reinforcing again the ask for resources that will be needed to make this successful at the local level.
Thank you, Damien. And over to Matt Krall's room.
Well, Paige tried to nominate several other people to be the reporter, but they all left. So Paige is up.
Well, fell back on me. So we spent some good time talking about the climate-friendly areas. We did discuss housing affordability and gentrification, being able to mitigate gentrification. I discussed a practice that is required with Department of Transportation and projects that will adversely impact and require folks to move or businesses to be moved. It's called the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Policies Act. I'm not sure if that sounds familiar. It's often called the URA. It's been in place for about 40 years now because of the practices that have happened in the past. But essentially, it does do a good job at calculating the impacts from a financial perspective on residents that may be dislocated or businesses, and compensating them sometimes for several years to help to soften the financial impact that has on populations. But to take it a little bit further, if we use that as part of any development application within a CFA to actually try to keep people within the CFA when a development happens by subsidizing rents or subsidizing renovations of businesses so that they don't have to be moved, but we can help to soften the financial burden that is going to be caused, I think, from the market going up. So that's something that's in place. It's certainly not foolproof, but it is a best practice that happens in any major investment. And I guess also from one of our members, she said it happens in the CDBG process as well, and HUD funding. We also discussed the idea again of height, the height recommendation, and instead emphasizing a minimum density or a minimum height requirement might be better, so that, again, we have that outcomes approach where we're not requiring a certain height or a certain number of square feet per unit, but that we're instead allowing that flexibility with the cities and giving them minimums. Similar with parking, not looking so much at minimums and maximums, but trying to do a ratio. We also talked about the performance standards and the performance measures, and I was a little confused about how the performance standards were supposed to be applied. And these are the ones that are on page 53 of the packet with equity, safety, accessibility, efficiency. I thought that was actually going to be something required as part of our TSP process and looking at the entire network. Matt did describe that it's actually much more narrower than that, and that it's targeted to zone changes and development reviews, not necessarily an entire TSP's creation or when it gets amended. So I thought that was a good clarification. I think that's the highlights.
Thank you so much, Paige. Over to Bill's group, and then we'll go to Evan's group.
Yeah, thank you. Samantha agreed to report out for us. So Samantha. So
a lot of what we discussed is all the other groups has discussed, which is good. But we started out by talking about, there was a desire from some individuals to really emphasize that, local governments would need to adopt the financially constrained projects plans. And that was, and there'd be some consequences if jurisdictions did not do so. There was a good discussion about feasibility there and feasibility with the rules in general, particularly around timelines and making sure that the timelines are workable, especially for the TSPs. I think that's something that we've talked about quite a bit. We had a really good and interesting discussion about safety and emergency access and making sure that if we do have future evacuation scenarios, that we're drafting rules that are workable for local governments. But also that we're making sure that we're not planning for future emergency response and that it has to be vehicle dependent. And we talked about finding maybe good examples from other jurisdictions who have figured out how to do emergency evacuation without having to be dependent on vehicles. Had a lot of discussion on the CFAs. I think the primary dialogue was making sure that the CFAs are written in a way that's going to have measurable impacts on reducing VMT and reducing the amount of dependence on cars, while still that broader conversation about how the density requirements and just general location of where CFAs may be in terms of land pricing is going to impact our ability to provide affordable housing and housing choice for individuals that live in CFAs. And we had a really good conversation about needing to dive into the specifics and take our time on these rules, and acknowledgement that status quo may not be what we need to be doing anymore, and having a broader look at possibly overall barriers to development that we need to have a conversation about as we move this rulemaking forward to make sure that it's all going to work together and achieve all of the goals that we want to achieve. And then I ended with a final comment, and I want to take the opportunity to say it again here, that we all have amazing intentions on this rulemaking, and just making sure that we're taking the time so that when we don't look back on this and we don't want to accidentally put another system in place that impacts communities of color or historically disadvantaged communities, and just a commitment to really dive into the details there. And I really appreciated that from the group.
Thank you, Samantha. And Evan, over to you.
Yes, I'm reporting out wide-ranging conversation on the transportation planning elements. We really wanted to focus on how to figure out exactly what we're trying to measure and implement, and the completeness metric was really important for walking and biking. Another bit of really trying to focus on things, doing an accessibility analysis, particularly in climate-friendly areas, just really making sure that governments are finding those gaps for accessibility to bus stops and so on, and figuring out how to fund and fill those gaps and be held accountable for that. On the climate-friendly areas, really had some good conversation about the market question and kind of how to make sure, things get built that we want to get built there, and that the rules aren't counterproductive on that, and making sure that CFAs include housing that's accessible for people with disabilities is kind of this unrecognized demand in the building industry often, for the increasing need and demand for that housing type. And the last thing, last two things, some challenges with ODOT's mobility standards are causing some delays and hurdles for some dense development throughout the region. LOI Town Center and Tiger Triangle, some work that may need to be done with our sister agency. And on a final note, I'm concerned about why we can't just be like Europe and have some, which manages to figure out truck loading and walkable great places and very high quality chocolate. Why can't we? No, that last bit was not true. Why can't we do that here? So lots of great thoughts.
Thank you so much, Evan. And thanks to everyone for those great report outs, really robust discussions. And, it's really a monumental effort for all of you to follow along with these rules and read them to the best of your ability. So thanks so much for continuing to do that through all of these meetings and bringing your voice in on how these can work better for your communities and the state. DLCD, any kind of final thoughts to close out this section before we get into just next steps and wrap up? Right. Okay. Then let's see. I'm gonna go into next steps, wrap up. I'll hand it over to Commissioner Warren just for some closing remarks. But actually, before I do, is there a next step slide or anything you want to say for follow up from this meeting? Okay, then I think that the commissioner might close us out for today. Oh no, Kirsten does. So let's have Kirsten go and then the commissioner can close us out.
Thank you. Sorry, it's a bad form to jump in front of your commissioners. Any way you look at it, I really apologize. But I did want to put a shout out. We're recruiting for the Local Officials Advisory Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Land Conservation, or an advisory body to the Land Conservation and Development Commission. I believe that closes on January 17th. And so I need to put out a posting to the Oregon Planners Network listserv on that today. And as well, I think Mallory and Ariel are sharing that with their members and helping to recruit. So if you have an elected official, a city or city councilor or county commissioner that you would like to make aware of that, I'll send that to Evan, and Evan, maybe you could put that in the chat too, so folks could just grab that. There's an application form on our website. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. And Chair MacArthur?
Yeah, I just wanted to, as long as Kirsten was making the plug for getting the word out on the local officials advisory committee, which is a really important committee that we want to resurrect after a short hiatus because of COVID. You might all also be aware that we are recruiting for a new director of the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I just want to make sure that you know that. And if any of you want to apply or think that there's a good applicant out there, please forward the materials to them. I think we could probably have the packet sent to this group. I'm looking at Kirsten perhaps for somebody to follow through on that so that you have it accessible to then forward out, make it as easy as possible. That recruitment ends, I think it's the 15th of January. So there's a little bit of time, but it's been on the street since the 1st of December. But we are looking for some great folks to continue the leadership of the department. So thanks for letting me do that plug.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Kevin?
Yeah, thank you. Just briefly, I feel I just need to clarify, we'll be sending out a follow-up survey after this meeting. We're asking for your comments back December 27th. So that's after the holiday weekend. And so you'll have plenty of time to drink cocoa by the fire and think about how we can improve our rules. Anyway, really appreciate your engagement today, but look for that survey coming out.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, then with that, over to Commissioner Warren for closing remarks.
Thank you, everyone, for those plugs. And I'm going to drop another plug for the Citizen Involvement Advisory Committee. We've got 2 open spaces there. So if anyone wants to get involved at that capacity, reach out to Sadie. And on with that, just so grateful for all of your involvement. I really feel like this group especially is so intentionally designed that we're hearing a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives that I don't think we would get without all of your continued involvement. So just so grateful for that. And I just want to take a second to kind of reflect on the process. You know, I really feel strongly that the process we've been utilizing to create these rules has been so inclusive. And obviously there's always issues with accessibility to these meetings. Some folks don't have access to internet or computers or whatever, but I really feel like we're trying to do the best job we can possibly do. And I just really thank staff for going above and beyond what they should have to do to create these rules. I think it's really important. So today we heard your thoughts on our equitable outcomes, and just wanted to reiterate some of the things that I took away from that. You know, we really need to focus our efforts on producing anti-displacement toolkits, which we've done. And I've asked staff to send out the webinar from Samuel Garcia on how to do that. So that should be coming along with your survey, I think, is what we're talking about. I also heard that we need to really be focused on increasing our understanding of who we are including and ways that we can kind of protect cultural resilience through this process. We heard about making transportation safety projects achievable, which I think is great. And we need to refine our density requirements or think about refining our density requirements to make them attainable for cities. And lastly, the need to work with the building codes to increase the safety of our homes. And those all relate to our equitable outcome statement. And as always, we look forward to your survey responses. So please take time, and we really, really appreciate your effort. I know we're asking a lot, but get those back to staff when you can. And then as Commissioner Lilac noted in the meeting, it's so helpful for the commission to hear where there are points of agreement and where there are points of disagreement, because ultimately we will be the ones who will be making those decisions at the end of the day. So I just want to invite you all to communicate with the commission. We're always available, and particularly Commissioner Lilac and myself. We want to hear from you. So please send us an email or get a hold of us. Love to continue the conversations that are happening right now. And just a big picture reflection that, like Commissioner Lilac brought up earlier, you know, this rulemaking is part of kind of I would call it a 3-pronged spear or trident, if you will. You know, the DEQ passed their rulemaking yesterday, and we're expecting to pass ours in May. And then ODOT is going to be working on some stuff as well. So just kind of that, keep that 30,000 foot level of where we are with this process. And there are other pieces being built to kind of help us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and improve our equity in our state. And at that, I will leave it to you all. Happy holidays. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Next RAC meeting is on January 20th. So everyone have restful holiday season, and we'll see you in 2020. Well, and of course there's the work groups in December 27th, 28th, 29th. So some of you may see each other there, but I will see you all in January. Happy holidays. Have a great rest of your day and weeks ahead.
Thank you.
Bye.